as a point of introduction for us, we started working with RWU about 10 years ago almost, when we were researching our book for our book Solutionary Rail, which is a book about rail electrification and mode shift and the use of rail corridors for transmission of renewable energy. So anyway, it got us into this whole world. Actually, we were challenged in around 2013 by Mike Elliott, railroad worker here in Washington State, who we were on the different sides of the issue of coal ports and oil trains. And he handed me a 2008 paper around and said, we worked on this around modernizing the Northern Transcon. Why don't you see if you and your people can green it? So that's what actually was. Labor actually is the entire reason we did Solutionary Rail. Conversations with Ron in those early days helped me sort of understand the issues that are faced by railroaders, chronic fatigue, and all those issues. So we integrated that into the book. We really treated the book as a way of trying to do a sketch of what an intersectional movement would look like that's built around rail, and building a rail system that's solving 21st century public interest problems, and it is working in the public interest, which is clearly in the workers' interests and in the community's interests and in the interest of the environment. I have to say I'm particularly heartened by Michael Paul Lindsay's comments, your comments, Mike, because I think you've done a consistently excellent job at making clear that this issue is far more complicated than just a wage issue. And I think that's what's been super clear to us at Solutionary Rail in our conversations with Ron and other members of RWU. And honestly, as we have this conversation with folks and we look at ask the question of what does solidarity look like, in the short term around this potential upcoming strike, and in the middle or longer term, what is it that brings us together? So I'm really excited that these other allies are participating in this conversation, because railroad workers are really sort of the canaries in the coal mine for an infrastructure that's been neglected. The more I look at it, I feel like in this country we did a giant experiment, and we put infrastructure. We partnered with private capital to put critical national infrastructure in the ownership of private corporations. And we have bent over backwards and done so many convoluted twists and turns in order to make sure that infrastructure was working in the public interest. Just as the robber baron class was working to make sure that infrastructure was working in their interests. That included, really significant regulation, starting in, with the Granger movement, and then the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, and the Interstate Commerce Act that regulated the railroads so that they could not discriminate against carriers. So if you're taking stuff a short distance to a county market, or you're taking something across the country, and you got a lot of a quantity, or you got a little bit of quantity, you don't get screwed on your rates, because right from the beginning, the railroads wanted to take a lot of stuff a long distance and screw the short haul farmer. So the battles have and a struggle to write a system that was potentially inherently flawed right from the start has continued on for 150 years. After World War II, folks, you're probably all familiar that we built the interstate freeway system, and that provided a public subsidy to rail's principal competitor, which is cars and trucks. And in terms of freight, that was a big, we were underwriting the external cost of that freight system for the trucks, the wear and tear, the public safety, the inefficiency of that fuel, and other issues and congestion. continued on, but it made it very hard for the rail industry to make a profit because it was relying on making a profit. And again, this is, I think, a failure of our original design. Tom White is on this call right now, and he always says, before 1970, we didn't talk about passenger railroads and freight railroads. We talked about railroads. And so for folks that don't know, in 1970, we responded to this crisis in terms of the competition around freight and the diminishment of the mode share that rail was carrying. That was our first thing, was to relieve them from the common carrier obligation to move passengers. And that was the start of Amtrak. And we lost a lot of passenger service in that time. We bailed out we took over a number of railroads and started the Conrail in order to save some of the East Coast freight movement around that similar time. In 1976, we actually started this process of exempting certain commodities from being regulated by what we call common carrier obligations. This non-discriminatory, publicly transparent rate structure and regulation of the transportation, freight transportation, and particularly the rail. So, and then in 1980, this is the big one that everybody talks about, is the Staggers Act. And in 1980, what we did then as a country is we instituted this idea that not just fruits and vegetables, but almost every commodity could be exempted from common carrier obligations, and communities, places, locations could be exempted from service. And those exemptions stand up till today, including for things like intermodal containers. They're actually exempted from common carrier obligations, which instituted the idea of contract carriers. So this took everything from a publicly transparent system that was highly regulated to protect the public interest, to make it a almost opaque system that was with contract carriers. And so now these public protections, they in their genomes, if you will, they still exist in statute. The even Staggers Act includes protections of the public interest. So even though the Interstate Commerce Commission was replaced by the Surface Transportation Board, and that Surface Transportation Board and Interstate Commerce Commission for years did nothing to hold the Class 1 railroads accountable. And when we talk about Class 1 railroads, between like 1984 and 2020, today, we went from 40 Class 1 railroads to only 7, and now potentially 6. And only 4 or 5 of those are based in the U.S. And those are CSX, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, and BNSF. So in that process of deregulation, we also lost thousands and thousands of miles of rail service to communities. So the big railroads, they spun off like 40,000 route miles of track to these things we call short line railroads now. So the short line railroads went from being a very small part of the picture to being, over 600 railroads that took over the branch lines that were less regulated, had less obligations, and were less profitable, all again for profit maximization. So between spinoffs and abandonments, we've lost 75,000 miles of route miles of track since 1970. And so when I think about this, and I interact with my friends working in environmental justice, or on the front lines of the supply chain impacts in warehouses and communities, and truck emissions on their communities, and honestly, and also rail yard emissions, I feel like those folks and the warehouse workers are really in the same battle with our allies in rail, because we've gone for the last 45 years into a neoliberal economic model that's all about profit maximization in order to increase profits. And we get deregulation and privatization, globalization, and austerity are the key pillars of that system. And what that's meant is that our infrastructure has, for profit maximization, has started to shape and reflect those values. And so it's shaped for a global supply chain, literally leaving communities and entire industries behind. So, I think when we think about what is solidarity in this moment, I think at the foundation of solidarity is finding common cause in that our infrastructure and our economy and our policies need to be work for the public interest, not merely for the maximization of profit and the concentration of power to a few. So, as way of introduction, I hope that's you appreciate y'all indulging me on that. But I want to now invite in and start asking some questions from our RWU guests about the moment that we're in relationship to this potential rail strike in mid-September. Everybody, this is Ron Kamenkow. Ron is the former General Secretary of Railroad Workers United. And Railroad Workers United is not an actual union. It is actually a formation of with membership from all the craft unions engaged in railroad. And so they've been a very progressive voice and have been pushing for this sort of joint negotiations. And I guess I'm going to start by just asking Ron to maybe say a couple things about the history of the fragmentation of rail labor over the years, and relate that to what's unique about the bargaining that happened most recently.
Okay, thanks, Bill. And hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm up in the Sierra Nevada in a little cabin. Internet's not too great here. Yeah, rail labor. What a convoluted mess it is. We once had 26 unions, railroad unions in this country. Now they've been pared down to about a dozen or so, depending on how you slice them. And holding them together, of course, has been very, very difficult. At times, it's not even been on the agenda. Railroad Workers United has been pushing for the last 15 years since we were first organized in 2008 to get these unions to cooperate and work together. Ideally, we need a railroad workers union. You have a United Auto Workers, United Mine Workers, and so forth. We don't have a United Railroad Workers Union, unfortunately, because we got organized early, and back in the 1800s, workers generally, and this is true all across the world, organized by craft and trade. And so we ended up with an engineers union first, quickly followed by the firemen, the conductors, the brakemen, the telegraphers, the car inspectors, and so forth and so on. So through attrition, amalgamation, and so forth, this has now been pared down to 12 unions. But obviously, if we had a black union and a white union and a female union and a male union, or a gay union and a straight union, this would not bode well for solidarity in a workforce. And these are ideas that pretty much everybody in the workforce can agree in this day and age that would be incredibly divisive and fratricide to the highest order. But yet we have still a conductors union, a machinist union, an electricians union, and so forth, but we all work for the railroad. Well, the good news is that this time around, we ended up with most of those unions in a big coalition. And then as the Presidential Emergency Board loomed large, the other two unions sort of joined together. And so for a brief few short months, we actually had this thing called United Rail Unions. But unfortunately, I'm here to break the bad news to you that not really unexpectedly, because this is the history of what unions do in rail labor. As of yesterday, the International Association of Machinists, the Brotherhood of Railroad Carmen, and the Transportation Communication Union, those three unions, and it's not a coincidence, all three of those are actually affiliated to the IAM Machinists. They announced that they would be putting a tentative agreement in front of their members for a vote, and that tentative agreement has yet to be seen, but one can suspect it's very close, if not identical, to the recommendations of the Presidential Emergency Board. So that's kind of some late breaking news, Bill, on that whole question of the divisions in rail labor.
Is there anything that we should know about the history of railroad strikes that do you think is relevant and informs this moment, or is that too much in the weeds?
Well, I will say this: the rail industry has a long history of strikes. In fact, that's why the Railway Labor Act in 1926 was legislated 10 years before other workers actually got the formally recognized right to strike. But don't get me wrong, the Railway Labor Act is a double-edged sword, and what it gives with one hand, it takes away with the other. And so the idea that we were first to be recognized as official organizations with the right to represent, the right to hold contracts, the right to bargain, and theoretically the right to strike was all codified in 1926. But it's also this piece of legislation that hampers us at every turn and has helped to, I would say, bureaucratize and ossify the rail labor movement. And it's also codified these craft unions so that under the National Mediation Board, which is how we organize, that's the government body that sort of regulates and recognizes unions, you pretty much have to petition the NMB through what's called an A-card drive by craft and carrier. So it kind of locks in this antiquated system. But anyway, back to the strike question. So railroad workers went on strike constantly, and the industry was not happy about it. Workers, of course, were routinely blacklisted and beaten up, endless picket lines, endless struggles, and the economy, of course, suffered. And so there was some interest in the government, the carriers, and the unions, or at least some of the carriers, the smaller ones, not the big giant ones who were very resistant to unionization. So they all got together in a way to sort of foment labor peace, if you will. So the last century has been a lot more, quote, peaceful than the century that came before, where striking was pretty much just a part of the landscape.
So in the beginning of this year, Railroad Workers United saw a sort of a unique opportunity and produced a statement encouraging railroad workers to use the tactic of a strike. I've just pasted the link to the strike resolution from January. Is there anything you'd like to say about that, either one of you?
Railroad workers have the right to strike. Many of us believe we don't because the Railway Labor Act makes it so difficult to actually carry out a successful strike without government intervention. But we do have the right to strike. And if you have a right and you never use it, what's the point of having it? So whether we go on strike or not, in some way, I don't want to say it's neither here nor there, but part of the power of a strike is the threat that you're going to use it, and to make your enemy, the rail carrier, understand that we are ready, willing, able, educated, fired up, angry, pissed off, and equipped to do this. It's hard to show the rail carriers that if your unions are basically taking the approach that, no, we can't really do this, and just be patient and we'll get a good presidential emergency board recommendation and so forth and so on. And we want to control our own destiny. We don't want Congress to order us back to work and blah, 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 ad nauseum. The fact is, whether or not we go on strike and whether or not that strike gets ordered back to work in 6 or 8 or 10 hours or 2 or 3 days, we have to be ready, willing, and able to carry it out. And this round of bargaining, where the carriers have been so intransigent, and where the stars are in alignment for us in so many ways, the labor movement is on the ascendancy once again. Unions in opinion polls are considered to be more favorable than they have been in half a century. The rail carriers, of course, continue to make record profits. There's a quote unquote labor shortage of workers on the railroad. Supply chains are in crisis. We have a friend of labor, a self-professed most popular or most labor-friendly president you'll ever have, to use his own words. Someone who's come out and very emphatically that he supports 2 crew members on every train. I mean, I could go on and on. The conditions are so favorable for us to actually win something for a change, that the strike should be, of course, on the agenda along with all the rest of the tools in our toolbox. And so that's where RWU was coming from when we promulgated that resolution back, I think it was earlier this year or later last year.
Well, great. I would like to go to the recommendations of the Presidential Emergency Board and RWU's response to it. And the first thing I saw in reply to the Presidential Emergency Board was something by our friend and guest here, Paul Lindsay, or Michael Paul Lindsay. A really excellent piece in
Railway Age.
Thank you.
It's the company rag.
Right. And I'm glad Company Rag actually printed that. Those of us who have been following our rail issues over the last few years, in this past year, and a lot of the folks who are on this call are in organizations who signed on to a letter to Surface Transportation Board Chairman Marty Oberman, thanking him for some initial strong statements about the Class 1 railroads. And some of us have even sat through the 17 hours of Surface Transportation Board testimonies that you participated in, Michael. The shippers have been complaining a long time about the impacts of this system, precision scheduled railroading, which we've talked about before, but is really just about profit maximization, which is just the whole history that we were going through before, just on steroids. And we can get into that if you want, but I think a lot of folks, we've had conversations about PSR, precision scheduled railroading, before. What I would like to do now is say, okay, so the Presidential Emergency Board basically said it's all about the money, pretty much, right? And Michael, your response was, no, it's not all about the money. So could you say a little bit about what you saw in the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations, Michael Paul Lindsay?
Well, thanks for having me, Bill. I saw initially that it seems like they just want to pay us off. They basically want to pay us off. They think that if they get the right percentage that makes us look greedy enough, that not only can they convince the people, the dumbest among us, who are, can be enticed by money, but that they can also convince the general public that we're just overpaid and greedy. And that is really, that's tactical. I mean, these are intelligent people. They have, armies of attorneys at their disposal. And by focusing on the pay increase and trying to make it seem like it's a really large pay increase, they are not just offering us a pay increase, but they are actively, that is an active PR move to try to make us look like we're just being greedy. They didn't even hardly mention in there the issues that were really being discussed, which was the attendance policy, being able to take days off, the board lineups, this whole idea that the carriers want to go to self-protecting pools, which I don't know if you read in the Section 6 notice about self-protecting pools, which is what the carriers wanted. And it would affect some places, some terminals differently than others. But that one thing in itself, self-protecting pool turns, it's overlooked because people don't understand it. That would devastate my terminal. It would make it to where any quality of life that we had is gone. And they don't care about that. They mentioned nothing about that. They punted it back to the carriers. And then the other thing, and I keep bringing it up, but I genuinely believe that it's probably the most important issue, because it's more of a philosophical question to ask, is why are we paying taxes on our meals when these CEOs are not? I mean, we have not received, it's been a big discussion in the depot. When's the last time that we received a pay increase on our away from home meal allowance? And For us, it depends on what railroad you are and what terminal you're in, but nowhere is it the $60 IRS suggested amount. For me, I can be gone for 2 days, and that's $12. And that's the only portion of our pay that's not subject to railroad retirement, tier 1, tier 2, Medicare, federal or state. It's not subject to any of it. It benefits our pay dollar for dollar. And during this entire negotiation, they could have offered us, hey, we'll take your existing pay and we'll just redesignate what the IRS says. And it would have given us on the road a massive pay increase in real purchasing power, not just a dollar amount here. We're giving you a dollar amount increase and they're going to tax half of it away from you. So that was not addressed. And, I loved in there how the railroads were in a discussion over whether they should use CPI or whether they should use the other form for inflation. Did you read about that at all?
No.
So you know what CPI is, I'm sure, Consumer Price Index.
Yeah.
And it's not perfect. I would argue to say in a lot of ways, there's a lot of evidence to show that inflation is higher than the CPI in a lot of ways. But the unions were arguing we should use the CPI to determine our wage increase. And the railroads were trying to use this other method, which uses substitution. And they were saying, well, this is much better. This is a much more intelligent way of calculating inflation. So CPI is simply a basket of goods. Every year or every quarter, whenever they do it, they run a basket of goods. Okay, here's a pound of beef, a pound of chicken, whatever, a pound of flour, a pound of bacon, a head of lettuce, hundreds of different items that go in there, and they compare every year which prices go up and which goes down, and that gives you an index that you can base your inflation off of. Well, the railroads are trying to go to this other index and try to say, well, when you can substitute. So yeah, beef went up, 9%, let's say this year, but chicken only went up 3%. Well, you don't need beef. You can substitute for chicken. So that means that actually the inflation rate really wasn't as high as you think it was. And I want to know, is Lance Fritz and old Footsie over at the CSX, are they substituting beef for chicken?
Right. Yeah, and I think that gets us to some of the core issues here of that for the last number of years, in the last 6 years, railroads have either laid off or pushed out up 45,000 employees. I mean, 29% reduction in the pay in the labor force in the last 5 or 6 years approximately. And meanwhile, the class 1 railroads are booking record profits for year after year, even during the pandemic. So it's not really just about the money, and it's about the quality of life. So they're nickel and diming the railroad workers around, their meals as they're away from home. But what about having to be away from home? What about the quality of life?
That's
right,
that's
Jason?
the other thing.
Yeah. What could you talk to us and let us know, for people who are used to having a work schedule, we know when we're going to work, we know when we're coming home, we know which days we're going to have with our family. We have control over that. Could you maybe describe a little bit of what it's like in your world?
Okay. Well, if someone asks me, well, when do you get off work? It's always the same answer. I don't know. When do you go to work? I don't know. Some days I have more time off, or some weeks I have more time off than others, but it's just a flat out question mark. I mean, imagine you got a dentist appointment that you just made it to, and this just happened to me. You have a dentist appointment and they ask you, well, okay, we want to schedule you in for your next 6-month appointment. What day works for you? I don't know. Just put me on there and then call me as it gets closer, pester me about it, and hopefully I can make it. I'll probably end up changing it 2 or 3 times before I actually make it to one. Another one is so these lineups are inconsistent, and they're made worse by PSR doubling and tripling trains and all the things they like doing. They are never, if a train's on the lineup, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go out when it says, or whether it even goes out at all. I'll give you an example. Just a couple weeks ago, I'm lined up for a train. I was first out on the board. I should have gone out at any time, and I waited up all day for this thing. And what they ended up doing is this train never actually went out because another train came in and they doubled that train on top of it, made it 15,000 feet long, never called that spot. And then about the time I'm getting tired, about 10 o'clock at night, is about the time they finally called me to work.
Wow. Wow.
And yeah. Oh, good.
No, I was just going to say that one of the things, we showed up that encouraged as folks were concerned about, after Loch Megantic, the rail disaster, the oil train in Canada, we started to see there's common cause between environmental and community activists along with railroad workers, that these long trains, these dangerous trains, require, to have multiple person crews, and we need people who are alert, and the move to a single person, the pressure to move toward a single person crew, and the workaround of having trains that are no longer just a unit train being a mile long, but it's 2 miles and longer than 2 miles
3
long.
miles.
It's insane. So, and the government accounting office has been looking into that. There is pressure on these things. But these are things that are all about profit maximization. They have railroad workers on call 24/7 and with very little control over their time or schedule. And it's all for profit maximization for this industry that is booking record profits and doing stock buybacks and actually leaving demarketing what they call less profitable shippers. So shippers who aren't meeting their operating ratio goal, that is, the expense of operating versus your ratio to revenue, that if they aren't helping you meet that goal, you can just set them aside. And because of all the deregulation that's happened around common carrier obligations being sometimes replaced with contract carrier obligations, we get into a situation where we have the railroads are doing less with less, and they're putting the burden of this broken, inhuman system on the backs of the workers. The workers are the ones, and then they get punished when anything happens bad, which is inevitable when I hear about your story or Jason Daring's story about, you were waited all day, and at 10 o'clock when you're getting tired, they send your train out. So, it doesn't make any sense. It's dangerous, and it's not in the public interest. It's not in your interest.
Keep in mind that you mentioned, I heard you mention about profitability and share buybacks and dividends. Now, keep in mind, in 2021, Union Pacific alone, they increased their dividend, just their dividend, by 20%. So if the inflation rate for a 5-year contract should only be 24%, why did they raise their dividend by 20% last year?
Yeah. And who's
just figured I'd
this
mention
industry operating, I mean, that was one of the things we liked about Surface Transportation Board, Marty Oberman's statement. He talked about stock buybacks exceeding over I'll get the years, but
capital investment,
right? Exceeding capital investment, right? The stock buybacks to make shareholders happy is exceeding, and pump up the share values is exceeding the capital investments in the infrastructure. And again, at whose expense? At the public's expense, forcing more trucks onto the road, forcing that's impacting all our environmental justice allies, resisting any kind of modernization or investment in the long-term improvements of the emissions on workers and communities through electrification, et cetera, and forcing more wear and tear, and diminishing service, leaving shippers behind, and it doesn't make any sense in a moment where we need to be using the most efficient source of ground transportation, which is our railroads, to ship more and more stuff. They're going in the opposite direction of the public interest. And sadly, the president's emergency board came up with something that made it all about money, when it really is about stuff that's much greater than that. And I hope that that folks can ask questions to help us clarify where the solidarity is, and how our investment in and solidarity together could be supporting this potential strike. So pivoting quickly to this to the strike. So in 1992, I read, that it was only the machinists at CSX that went on strike. I don't know if that's true or not, but you've lost 3 of the unions who are part of this cohort of rail labor to this that bought into the agreement. But that you still have don't you still have plenty of workers like that? They represent like 15,000 of the workers. You got 100,000 of the workers still poised for potentially to go on strike. So could you speak about the potential of the upcoming strike, and where are you at? And maybe, Ron, this would be a good time to talk about the RWU poll on how are workers feeling about the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations and the potential to strike, because you all just did a survey, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, Bill. And for those who are interested in looking at the survey results, there's some nice graphs and pie charts. And in fact, you can also get the raw data in a view only form, but there's not too much actually to manipulate, even if I had sent out the actual Excel spreadsheet, because it's overwhelming for the most part, whether you're high senior, low senior, old or young, whether you're a track worker, a car inspector, a machinist, any one of those 3 unions actually that I mentioned earlier, an engineer or a conductor, it's 90 to 95%. I mean, it's actually a fairly boring survey results because it's so lopsided and so overwhelming that every craft, every union is basically in the 2 big questions that we're asking. If the Presidential Emergency Board were to serve as the basis for a tentative agreement, would you vote for it? And it's about 93 to 94% of everybody says no. And then the next question, do you believe railroad workers should utilize or exercise, I don't have it right in front of me at the moment, their right to strike? It's even more impressive. It's more like 95, 96% of all of the respondents say yes. And if you do break it down by union, there's really very, very little difference. The TCU, I think, I haven't digested it all yet by manipulating the data, but the TCU, whose leadership, of course, just announced that they would be presenting a tentative agreement to the members. According to our survey, 90% of TCU workers will vote no. We had a lot of track workers, 640 some responded to the survey. Interestingly, the PEB actually recommended something for the track workers. So each of the different crafts wanted some changes in things other than rates of pay. The PEB only suggested or recommended that the track workers, BMWED, get what they were asking for at the bargaining table. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that rail carriers are going to agree to this, but at least this is in the PEB recommendation. That seems to have had, at first glance, absolutely no effect on our survey in terms of track workers now saying, yeah, we're going to vote for this thing, which I find to be fairly curious. Just as by the same token, it's fairly curious that the leadership, or I like to call them officials because I don't really see a whole lot of leadership there, but the officials of TCU, BRC, and IAM have all said they're going to package the PEB recommendations as a tentative agreement, send it out to the members for a vote. it's quite possible the members will vote this down overwhelmingly, but of course it remains to be seen. Once the carriers, the union leadership, the media, et cetera, and even, family members, or even, as Michael talked about, I mean, in a sense, this is bribe money. Kick it down the road for another 5 years. We'll have living hell on the job, but at least I'm going to get, a decent wage increase. Oh, but wait a minute, about inflation. And I'm going to get that back pay lump sum settlement here sometime this fall, just in time for Christmas. And so we don't really know that the results of this survey will hold up when it comes time to actually vote. So, it's a dynamic situation. And Railroad Workers United, I was just talking to one of our co-chairs about the prospects of calling a special meeting in the next couple of days to discuss if and when we actually organize a vote no campaign, which is something we did 8 years ago on BNSF around the 2-person crew issue. And it was quite successful. Those workers voted that tentative agreement down by a 5-to-1 ratio. So we'll see what the coming hours and days holds.
Thank you, Ron. Ron, one of the things that that folks have done in the past, is write letters of solidarity and support for railroad workers. So one of the things Backbone Campaign Solutionary Rail is putting together is a draft solidarity letter. And so if folks wanted to sign on to that, I will find that link in my at the earliest convenience and post in the chat. But are there other ways that you think that this moment offers allies, say warehouse workers or truckers or community environmental justice organizers or climate activists, anybody, opportunity for solidarity, and what might that solidarity look like to you?
So I think that any of these organizations or anyone that wants to actually, I guess, through solidarity, try to change and build on this momentum that we have, the only way that it can really, really be done right now is to expose these companies, whether it be railroads or anyone else, you have to expose them. And that, I think, is the difference between right now, what we have going on, and what's happened in the past is there's exposure to it. The supply chain shortages that people are seeing, the quitting, it doesn't matter whether it's in retail or transportation or wherever people are quitting. It's making, the news, and it's making articles, and it's making it as bad as far as our industry, making it to federal hearings. You expose them and you air out their dirty laundry the best you can, because if you don't do that, then basically the propaganda that you get from these companies is all the general public is going to have. And I think that I've tried to do that to the best of my ability. And I think what's just fantastic is that, I don't know if you read the Trains Magazine article recently about it, but the author of Trains Magazine, he put together how many people had historically ever written to the Surface Transportation Board, and it was none. It's never happened. Maybe some unions wrote to them. It's never happened. But all of a sudden, over 40 people of all crafts, carmen, train and engine crews, maintenance away, signal, everyone wrote in. And it's exposing the railroad and their dirty laundry. And that can be done for all these companies that are trying to create change, because if you shut up and you allow them to spew their narrative, then people are just going to go back to sleep. You'll end up with people that are just believing that, well, you guys are just greedy. What, you don't want a 24% raise? We got to be vocal and loud about it in one way or another. That's the only way that we can really keep it going.
Once again, because of the nature of the unions, if we were to run an effective strike and an effective contract campaign, this stuff starts before bargaining demands should have even been exchanged. So 3 years plus ago, the unions really, to be effective, need to do what's called a contract campaign, and that entails involving the members at every step of the process. Our unions generally, unfortunately, are very bureaucratic, very cautious, very conservative, and very top down, and don't really have, it's ironic because we had such a fighting history as a militant rank and file formation to have degenerated into these sort of top heavy bureaucracies. And it's like, don't worry, we got this. And we're gonna make a deal with the rail carriers that this is going to be done behind closed doors, and both sides agree we're not going to go to the media, blah blah blah. Well, this just plays right into the carriers' theater, because it cuts the leadership off from the rank and file. We do not feel involved. We are not invited to be involved. So tragically, at this stage in the game, when we are literally poised to potentially mount a strike in about 17 or 18 days, finally, the biggest union, Smart Transportation Division, just today, it looks like, sent out a notice to their membership, to the local unions, to be prepared. I mean, 16 days, we've had 3 years. And so I don't want to beat this, but we would like to see, to be effective, the members involved from day one. We have to play the hand that's dealt us. We have not been asked to participate. Obviously, Railroad Workers United has not been asked by the trade union leadership to do this or anything else that we've been doing, including putting together strike t-shirts. We sold over 350 strike t-shirts. We've distributed probably tens of thousands of stickers and buttons. Once again, we're doing it. The union leadership is not calling for it. It's not a coordinated action, and we're playing catch up. So here's a few things directly related to if there is a strike. People should, keep their ear to the rail, pay attention to what's going on. I did put a link in the chat where you can subscribe to the RWU news service every Tuesday morning. Basically 12 articles. You can check it out and see what's going on in rail labor, and that will include these kind of developments around the National Freight Agreement. Find out where the yard is in your city or town, where the terminal is, and that's where the picket line is going to be. And it gives a great opportunity for you to join rank and file railroaders if and when there is a picket. Who knows, we might do some informational picketing if the unions can rise to that occasion. But there could potentially be some kind of picket line, strike or otherwise, in the coming weeks and months. So it'd be great to see people from other unions, environmental groups, transportation justice, and so forth. So that's just a few things.
For some of the communities that are impacted by being adjacent to rail yards, as you know, they're impacted by the diesel emissions of the trains and, and these ports. And maybe another thing, what we're not seeing in, in the conversation is any sort of statement around the impact on the communities and the potential for electrification and the aspiration for these for our railroads to be a solution to some of those problems that are hitting some of our communities. I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot on that, but I just want to just put that out there that that folks who are hit by the supply chain are the workers and the communities that are along the tracks. And so I just, another thing that comes to mind is that, if Congress has to shut this down, how can we pressure Congress to do better than the Presidential Emergency Board did? Like, maybe this is where we can say, you know what, as environmental justice activists and organizers, or as, climate activists and organizers, whatever, that that we would like to see a different approach to the railroads, rather than celebrating this doing less with less for fewer to maximize profit. We'd like to see this infrastructural treasure that we as a society have invested in from the very beginning, to actually be oriented towards serving our communities and protecting the health of our people and the health of our planet. And so when you intervene in this strike, we hope that you will also raise the issue of long-term capacity and the hiring and the shortage of why is there a shortage of workers? Why is there a shortage of resilience in the system? Why is there the system fighting to just provide service to the existing shippers instead of increasing its modal share and winning back shippers to get trucks off the roads and out of our communities? I mean, I wonder about that kind of attempt. So if we can basically guarantee that Congress is going to intervene. So when they intervene, what can they say that's actually going to make a difference and build solidarity that is cross movement solidarity?
Yeah, you have to get money out of it. I mean, that's the way I look at it. How can you guarantee that Congress is actually going to behave ethically? And that's where it's going to have to be, is on a regulatory level, but you have to get money out of it. And you know how hard that is to do. And I would argue going against these big four rail carriers and asking them to invest in their infrastructure and do what's good for the nation, humanity as a whole, they're not going to do it because there's big money involved. And really, they're all owned by the same people anyway. So is there really any competition between the railroads? But yeah, you have to, I would say you definitely would have to get money involved and actually somehow, I think part of that starts with actually maybe enforcing our antitrust laws in this country first. That would probably, and that's not even necessarily railroad related, but it is. Until we start doing that, these big corporations are just going to continue doing whatever they want, and what they're doing is illegal.
Yeah, but and antitrust is good when it comes to like Amazon. The Athena Coalition is working on that, and these other efforts. But the antitrust regulation of the railroads is in the Surface Transportation Board.
But it's not.
It's not.
We did away with all of that. I mean, basically, the Surface Transportation Board doesn't have any teeth. It has the potential to, but you have to pass a Surface Transportation Board Reauthorization Act that actually gives the appropriate authorities that you want. And they've done that time and time again. That's actually what Representative Payne in New Jersey, his bill, I'm sure you're familiar with that. I mean, that's basically what it is, a Surface Transportation Board Reauthorization bill, but I don't think it went far enough. You mentioned earlier in your intro about exempted commodities that are not subject to regulation. And his legislation is supposed to be providing some sort of mechanism to fine railroads when they mishandle private assets, private cars. But it only really applies and has teeth to non-exempted commodities and as far as I'm concerned, it should apply to all the commodities.
Absolutely.
So I agreed with you on there.
All right. Well, cool. And I want to make sure that Herb Crone gets a chance to chime in. Herb, you've been an ally and leader in this in Washington State and with Solutionary Rails project for a long time. We've learned a great deal from you. I'm eager to hear your perspective.
Well, first, I just want to point out that the Railway Labor Act, which governs all of this, is really outdated. And the Railway Labor Act and its provisions were not designed to protect workers. They were designed to prevent railroad work stoppages. And so the whole design of the system and the laws that govern how work stoppages to take place are designed to prevent them almost entirely. If we see a rail strike on the 16th or the 17th thereabouts, these are very rare rare events because of the Railway Labor Act. And when it was passed, 90% of the freight shipments in the United States went by rail. And there were a huge number, there were 150 plus class 1 railroads. And now we're down to 5 or 7 today, depending on how you want to count them. And the Railway Labor Act really needs to be updated for the times, because the prevention of keeping rail labor from striking is really what has set us back now for a long, long time, because the railroads know they can tell us to pound sand on almost any given issue, and a strike is almost impossible to do. One of the biggest issues on the railroads, of course, are quality of life issues. Rail workers do not have paid sick leave for the most part. There are a few crafts that do have some types of provisions for that, but for operating craft, brakemen, switchmen, conductors, engineers, the people who work and operate the trains, we have no paid sick leave. And we are now being disciplined for taking unpaid time off for illnesses and injuries of ourselves and our family members. We are disciplined for taking unpaid time off for bereavement for uncovered relatives, because the only relatives that are covered by the bereavement policies are your parents, your children, your spouse, your siblings, and your spouse's parents. That's it. Anyone else is not covered. And the railroads have cut staff immensely for profits. There is a very interesting article put out by a Harvard researcher in February that shows that the railroad corporations created America's supply chain crisis for the purposes of making profits. I mean, this whole scenario we're facing in America today was created by the railroads, and they have profited immensely from it. Pay, 24% sounds great, but of course we would not get 24% today over the life of the agreement, which would extend out for about 2 more years. By the end of it, it would be a 24% increase. Well, I live in Seattle. We've seen our wages decrease immensely because of inflation. And if we were to get 24% today, we would still be 2% behind where we were when this agreement was adopted 7 years ago. Wow. The one that we're currently operating under. One of the other big issues is the problems with cost of living in higher cost areas, the West Coast, East Coast, Denver, Chicago, other places that have higher costs of living. The issues around meals, I mean, you get paid $12 a day for meals. And it used to be that you could deduct the difference between that $12 and whatever the federal allocation was for the city that you were in for meal costs. And that was taken away under the Trump tax cuts. So now our meals are essentially being taxed. And this is just an outrage, because we're paying more taxes as rail workers and transportation workers than we ever were before, because we cannot deduct those types of expenses that the railroads refuse to pay. The last thing I want to point out is on crew size. I want everyone to know that the FRA has put out a notice of proposed rulemaking to establish a 2-person crew on most trains. It is up for comment now. It is imperative that everybody comment, everyone we know, comment and advocate for that, but also that we advocate and everyone advocates strongly that the federal regulation should not preempt state laws that are more stringent regarding crew size. In Washington, we've adopted one of the most stringent state laws in the nation. And if a new administration were to come in and wipe off the regulation, they would be on much stronger ground to say that the federal government can now preempt crew sizes. And we don't want that to happen. States should be allowed to have greater or more stringent safety requirements when it's in the interest of public safety, workplace safety, or environmental safety to do so. The federal regs tend to be the floor, and when they should be the floor, not the ceiling. The accident that happened at Mosier, Oregon, the oil train disaster there right along the banks of the Columbia, occurred because the federal regs on track inspections are the ceiling, and they are not the best practice. They're the minimal standards that the railroads wanted. To run geometry cars over tracks. They did that 2 days before the accident. It didn't find any of the rusted tie bolts or that caused the accident and caused the track to fail. The states need to have the ability to have more stringent safety standards. So it's imperative. The FRA has asked people to comment on whether it should preempt state laws or not, and we urge people to get their comments into the FRA by mid-September, urging the FRA not to preempt more stringent state laws regarding crewing. I'm happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question that came up was a great question is, how do we sign up to join the picket line? So how are we going to get the notice when something happens so that allies can join the picket line?
Well, the picket, we have to be given authorization from each respective president's office.
Gotcha.
A part of it is going to depend on whether the 3 unions that have announced tentative agreements adopt those agreements. If they don't, then all the unions will be engaged in picketing, and we'll all be working together. But it's going to be up to the locals. We've got to put picket lines up at every access point for vehicles, motorized vehicles, and access to workers at rail yards, and that may be difficult in some places. But as we get closer, we'll know. I'm happy to share with you where in the Seattle area you can join picket lines, but it's going to be basically on the sidewalks adjacent to every rail access point in the freight yards. The other thing is Amtrak will not be striking per se for the most part. I don't know if any of their unions are part of this, but I know their operating crafts unions agreements are not at this point yet. But we will probably want to put picket lines up at Amtrak stations as well. But we're not at, some of these things have not been determined, but it's up to each local in the area to put picket lines up. And I'm happy to coordinate with you as we get closer to that event. We'll need help because we have to man picket lines 24/7. The strike would begin on a Friday. That's the other thing people have been asking. Congress can do many different things. They can impose this PEB by law. They can do what's been done before. I think President Kennedy did one. They can direct the president to appoint an arbitration panel to hear the dispute and issue binding terms to resolve the dispute. They can adjust what the PEB did, or they can do anything they want, basically, in terms of ordering rail workers back to work. We would expect that they'll act quickly, but it depends on whether Congress lets people go home for the weekend or not, because the strike would, if it begins on the 16th, that's a Friday morning, and usually most of Congress is on their way home by Thursday afternoon. So we'll know by early on the week of the 12th, when Congress reconvenes, what their schedule is, whether they're going to tell members to stay around through the end of the week or through the weekend for potential sessions. And then the president does have to sign it.
What if Congress says you can't strike, and so you get 20% of the, or 10% of the workforce is already highly strained, to say we just can't do this job anymore. We tried. That's
if this is what's going to happen if the PEB is adopted. It's just not enough for people, particularly in West Coast areas and East Coast areas and high cost of living areas, to continue working. I mean, I can go to work in a bakery here in Seattle and take home as much as I would as a new hire railroad worker. And I'll have a regular schedule. And if I get sick, they're not going to discipline me for not showing up to work.
Right. And they're not going to dick you around and make you stay in the yard all day. And they're not going to cut all your maintenance and all that other stuff. Okay, so
right. And if this gets imposed, you're going to have a lot of railroad workers who are going to wait around for the back wages and pay. And as soon as they get those checks, they're going to leave. We've seen an exodus from rail employment of workers after BN adopted their horrible attendance policies in February. People with 10, 15, 20 years are walking away from their railroad jobs and away from their railroad pensions.
Yeah, so thanks, Herb. Appreciate you chiming in. It's really great to see you.
Indeed, I don't have a camera hooked up to the computer today.
No problem.
Quality of life is one thing. Safety has not been mentioned, and it is one of my really severe sticking points. There's talk of bad lineups. There's been talk of bad lineups for a long time, and it's worse now. So here's a scenario. One of my colleagues here gets off of his train after 12 hours, and it looks like he's going to be going to rest or going to work about 16 hours from now. So there's no point in going to bed right now, even though he's tired, because of the fact that he needs to be rested 16 hours from now. So he goes out and hangs around, does some stuff. He goes to bed about 6 hours from now. And lo and behold, they call a train on his rest for 8 hours from now. So he's had 2 hours of sleep in the past 2 days, and he's going to go out there and run the train for another 12. Or the other way around, the lineup says that there won't be another train for 16 hours when he gets in. So he's going to, the other way around, they've got a train is going to be called on his rest. So he goes to bed right away. And lo and behold, the train doesn't happen, and he gets called 20 hours later, and he hasn't had any sleep. In either case, guys are falling asleep on the engine. I've seen it, been there. And after the big smoking wreck, FRA and NTSB will have an investigation, and they will say, conductor and engineer were off duty for 27 hours and were fully rested. That will happen invariably, that they won't ever publish all the changes in the lineup that have happened between the guy tying up and going on duty. And invariably, after the wreck, they'll blame it on the crew and say they were fully rested.
Thank you, Tom. So Paul or Ron, would you like to reply to Tom's excellent point there?
Those are all extremely excellent points. I mean, there are the last two people that have been on have really both hit the nail on the head with a lot of issues that weren't discussed. I've been thinking about, and yeah, he's right. The report will not show that the boards changed, that they weren't rested, that it was impossible essentially to be rested. And that's one of those things that's extremely difficult to convey to anybody, the general public or regulators or anything. And that is why, so you mentioned a big smoking wreck. Well, after the Chatsworth collision in 2008, that's why the Rail Safety Improvement Act came about. It was supposed to make it to where, and Ron, you probably know about this. It was supposed to make it to where the railroads actually did something that it was basically their arrest and risk mitigation. They were supposed to mitigate this by having some sort of regular schedule, some sort of anything. And the whole federal rest, working 6 days in a row and getting 2 days off, that was just by default that the federal government imposed on them because the railroads didn't care to do anything about it. They just let the federal government do it. But the whole federal rest thing is completely inadequate. And we're asking for schedules to be somehow created to where we have some predictability. I've thought of one example, and I don't know what other people would think about this, but 7 days on, 7 days off. That's the way the oil industry does it. At least you can look at a calendar and know I'm going to be off these days. I'm going to be on these days. Could have an extra board that covers the first and third week of the month and an extra board that covers the second and fourth week of the month. But it's something. At the present, they don't want to try. They don't care to try. They just want to make it look as well. According to statute, you're rested. and it's completely inadequate. And that came out with the PEB. They said, well, as far as work conditions and everything, that needs to go back to the unions and the carriers for more negotiation. That was right in the PEB. They didn't rule on any of it, and that's completely unacceptable.
Well, considering y'all have been having these conversations for years, why on earth would they throw that back
decades.
to between as if that's going to help?
First of all, yeah, Tom, good to not see you, but hear from you. Excellent points. Basically, this is why I am now working for Amtrak and left the freight industry kind of prematurely. 20 years ago, more or less, is when I bailed, when nobody was really leaving the freight industry in droves. And that trend has simply accelerated from that day to this, so that within the last 5 years, it's gotten so severe that workers just simply cannot bear it any longer. And at Amtrak, we have guys coming over from Union Pacific and BNSF with 5, 10, 15, 20 years seniority. Herb Chrome talked about the fact that people are now leaving the industry with 5, 10, 15, 20 years seniority. And yeah, with this PEB, there's full expectation that guys now are hanging around to get the back pay, and then they're out of here, because this contract, or rather this PEB recommendation, it did absolutely nothing on all of the issues specifically for trainmen and engineers to have a better and safer quality of work life. And in our summary that we put out last week, I believe it was, on just about every single work rule question, the PEB punted. They had one of two stock responses. The organization should withdraw the proposal, or the organization and the carrier should continue to bargain. Well, bargaining has gotten us nowhere for 2.5 years, and I thought the PEB's role was to actually step in. And so they literally did nothing on all of these questions. It's a huge letdown. And I think that's why, you know, the proof's in the pudding. Our survey is showing that upwards of 90–95% of workers, not just in T&E, but all the crafts, are finding it something that is untenable. We just can't continue to labor under these kind of conditions. So if we think it's bad now, if we get this rammed down our throat and eventually becomes part of a contract, I dread to think what the rail industry is going to look like in the coming months and years, because they're probably not going to be able to untangle the mess that they're in, because the staffing shortage now could become severe, and to the point where it's a vicious cycle, and even more and more and more workers start.
The PEB and the railroad industry and Railway Age magazine, they don't seem to get, and you only notice it if you look at the seniority roster. And these big carriers have a 2004 to 2007 problem. It's a big problem that no one's talking about, and that's that 2004, the rail industry started hiring in mass. It doesn't matter where you look at on the seniority roster at Union Pacific. I've looked at basically all of them, and they had a massive influx of people starting to hire on at the railroad in 2004, and it basically ended in 2007 and early 2008 as the financial crisis hit. And they hired countless thousands of people during this time. And I know in Pocatello, there is a massive group of 2004 guys. And you look at the clock, it's 2022. At 2024, those guys are going to have 20 years. And they don't want to be here anymore. At 20 years, you can go to the Railroad Retirement Board and say, I'm broken, I need a medical. You can say, you know, whatever. So, and the other problem is that these people that they hired, they weren't 18, 19-year-olds. They were like people mid-career that were 40 years old, and now they're approaching 60. Those are the people that they hired in 2004. And the railroad industry seems to think that just because you hired on at 04, that you're mid-career and that you still have 20 years left. That's just not the case. Most of those '04 guys, I would say a majority of them are not mid-career. They are late career, about to go, and the railroad is about to be blindsided by it because no one is mentioning it.
I think that we all want to stay in touch with RWU as a really pivotal. Use this as an opportunity to grow our solidarity and our collaboration, because I think this system is broken and it's in all of our interests to change it. And you all are at one of the front lines, and we're really grateful for you being here today to help us understand this issue a little bit better. But I'd like to give both Michael Paul Lindsay and Ron Kamankow an opportunity to send us home with a particular message or ask. And Michael, anything you'd like to share as we close in response also to Lindsay and to Jerry?
Well, Jerry, you mentioned something about you mentioned about the teachers union and the Sierra Club, and not and basically communication among people that have similar interests and goals in mind. And I would agree that absolutely needs to happen. I can't give you a great answer yet as to what could be done other than really getting the message out that the current system that we have, that we are under, you mentioned the Sierra Club environmentally, the current system we're under, where we endlessly subsidize freeways, and the railroad pockets every money that could be used for every bit of money that could be used for infrastructure. They basically pocket it in share buybacks and dividends. That's unsustainable. And I don't have a good answer yet on that, but I believe legislatively there's some answers. I've on the train, I have tons of time to think and discuss and bounce ideas off of guys that I work with. Some of them care about it more than others, but there's got to be solutions that we could come up with on a legislative level. And then in the meantime, we've got to, like I said earlier, expose these companies' dirty laundry, because unless we do that, none of these legislative agendas that we come up with will ever have any chance of getting passed either, because there's not enough public outcry about it. But Ron, what do you got?
Go to our website, railroadworkersunited.org. A pop-up block will come up. You can fill it out with your email address and you'll get our stuff. Back to Bill's question earlier about what can be done in terms of solidarity. It would be great for folks to weigh in on that whole two-person crew bill. Many of us have been told, from day one, can't have jobs in the environment, that workers and environmentalists are each other's natural enemies. This is all bullshit, of course, and it keeps us divided, just like the urban-rural divide, the black and white divide, immigrant, native-born, and all of these false divisions that have kept organized labor divided for years. And so now, that same game is being played between environmentalists and working people. But more and more, I think we're seeing, and in terms of rail in particular, it's handed to us on a silver platter. Most all environmentalists know that rail is the most efficient way to move goods and services and people around the country. And to move in a direction of rail would mean more railroad jobs. Since we're the most unionized sector of the economy, more union jobs, good paying union jobs, despite all the difficulties and problems that we have just heard about. But rail is a central component of a new society that is based on sustainability. And the sooner that the unions and groups like the Sierra Club and others can sit down at the table together and hammer out a joint proposal and a platform to make this happen, the better.
Well, thank you both very much. And just so everybody knows, we had to invite, because of the way the schedules work for the railroaders, we had to invite 4 railroaders and to get 2. And I'm really, but wow, what a couple of great guys you are. And it's so great to meet you, Michael Paul Lindsay, in person. I mean, I just, like I said in the beginning, you've just been really showing up in an incredible way
with your writing and your public speaking and the videos. Anything you say out there has been great. And Ron, your tireless leadership for so many years, and your patience with mentoring others along who are not familiar with rail, and bringing us into a sense of solidarity has been immeasurably valuable to Solutionary Rail and to me personally. I really appreciate it. And I think everybody here really appreciates the opportunity to get to spend time with you both. And we'll do everything we can to show up and show our solidarity, and for this short term, and for the long term. So, forward together. Injury to one is injury to all. Let's freaking do this thing. So here we go.
When all you
Thank
want
you.
to do is speak your mind, but someone keeps listening all the time, waiting ready